She opened the door with a soft smile and said, "My husband's out till morning." I should have walked away, but instead I stepped inside. The night was quieter than usual, the kind of stillness that makes you hear your own thoughts. A cool breeze slipped between the houses as I stepped out with the empty trash bag in my hand, the soft hum of the streetlight flickering over the pavement. It was late, too late for casual encounters, and that's why I almost didn't notice her at first. She was standing just beyond the hedge that separated our driveways, a porcelain mug cupped in her hands, steam curling gently against the night air. A light cardigan wrapped around her shoulders, loose strands of her hair brushing her cheek as the wind teased at them. Her eyes lifted to meet mine, and in that brief glance there was something I hadn't seen before, not just recognition, but a kind of softness, as if the night had made her less guarded. "Out late?" she asked with a small smile, her voice quiet enough that it didn't disturb the stillness. "Couldn't sleep," I replied, shifting the trash bag from one hand to the other. "Needed some air." She nodded, and for a moment it should have ended there. Neighbors exchange words, then retreat into their own warmth. But neither of us moved. The breeze carried the faint scent of jasmine from the small garden she tended in spring, mixed now with the sharper edge of her tea. I stepped closer to the shared fence, resting my fingers on the cold metal. Her gaze flicked to them briefly, as though noting the movement, then returned to my face. "It's a nice night," she said, and her tone was casual, but the way her lips lingered around the words told me she wasn't talking about the weather alone. "It is," I agreed. "Quiet." Silence filled the gap after that, but it wasn't the awkward kind. It was a silence that stretched, almost inviting more. She shifted her weight slightly, the hem of her cardigan falling open to reveal a pale silk top underneath. Not revealing, just lived in, soft, familiar. The glow from the streetlight caught the edges of her profile, the fine lines near her eyes, the curve of her lips when she half smiled at something she didn't say out loud. I realized how close I had come to the fence, the metal cool against my fingertips, the scent of her tea drifting closer now. We spoke of nothing important after that, something about how the nights were getting colder, how the town felt different at this hour. But her eyes stayed on mine a little too long each time I answered, and I found myself wondering when exactly neighbors become something more than just people living side by side. When she turned to go back inside, she didn't close the door fully. A sliver of warm kitchen light spilled onto the porch, cutting the chill of the night. I lingered, holding the bag of trash as though it suddenly weighed more than it should. And for the first time, I noticed that the quiet wasn't empty, it was expectant. The night had settled deeper by the time I set the trash aside and turned to leave, but her voice followed me across the cool air. "Would you like some tea? It's a bit too quiet tonight." I paused, fingers resting on the doorframe. It should have been a simple choice: say no, retreat to the safety of my apartment, let the night fade like it always does. But her voice had that softness in it, not quite loneliness, not quite an invitation, something in between. I glanced back. She stood just inside her doorway, one hand curled around her mug, the other holding the door open as the warm kitchen light pooled around her feet. Her cardigan slipped slightly from one shoulder, exposing a narrow line of skin before she tugged it back. "Tea sounds good," I said finally, quieter than I expected. Inside, her home felt lived in a way mine never did. A faint jazz melody floated from a speaker on the counter, the air carrying a soft trace of lavender. A throw blanket rested over the back of a couch, a book half open on the armrest. It smelled like fresh bread and something sweet, maybe candles that had burned out hours ago. She set a second mug in front of me, the steam curling gently upward. Our knees brushed as I sat down at the edge of the sofa, and neither of us moved them away. "So, what keeps you up at this hour?" she asked, stirring her tea though she didn't seem to need to. "Too much work lately," I said with a small shrug. "Or maybe not enough of the right kind." She smiled faintly, eyes catching the lamplight. "That's a clever way of saying something's missing." There was no accusation in her voice, no pity either. Just observation, like she'd said that to herself more times than she could count. For a moment I didn't know what to do with my hands. They hovered near the mug, fingers tracing the ceramic rim. Her hand moved just slightly, resting on the cushion between us, close enough that if I leaned the wrong way they'd touch. "Doesn't it feel strange?" she said after a pause, eyes on the steam rising between us. "How a house can be full of things, full of life, and still feel empty sometimes." I met her gaze then. It wasn't a question she needed me to answer, it was something she needed to say out loud. Outside, the wind pressed lightly against the windows. Inside, the world felt smaller, softer, almost suspended. When she leaned back, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear, her fingers brushed mine by accident. Or maybe not. It was the kind of touch that felt innocent in action but not in weight, like a word said with a double meaning neither wanted to admit yet. And in that quiet living room, with the distant hum of jazz and the faint lavender in the air, I felt the night tilt, just slightly, but enough to know it wouldn't fall back the same way again. The tea had cooled by the time the conversation began to stretch into something real. At first, it was the usual, neighbors talking about weather that wouldn't hold, about how the streets seemed emptier this year, about trivial things that floated easily between people who don't want to risk saying more. But somewhere between her soft laughter and the way her eyes lingered on mine, something shifted. She asked about my work, and I told her, not the polished version I give strangers, but the truth. About the late nights, the restless days, the creeping thought that I was building things I didn't really believe in. My voice dropped lower without meaning to, as if the walls themselves were listening. She didn't fill the silence. She just listened. Elbows resting on the table, chin propped against her hand, her eyes tracing me like she was piecing together a puzzle she already knew the edges of. "I used to feel that way too," she said finally, her voice soft enough to feel like a secret. "Before I learned that sometimes, you stop chasing something out there and start looking at what's already close." I wasn't sure if she meant me to hear the layers in that sentence, but I did. She laughed then, not a practiced laugh, but the kind that escapes when someone forgets to be careful. It softened her whole face, crinkling the edges of her eyes, catching in her voice. The jazz had faded to a faint murmur, the rain outside had started to patter lightly against the windows, and the world beyond that small kitchen seemed far away. I found myself telling her something I hadn't told anyone in months, about a project I had failed, about the weight of trying to seem fine when I wasn't. The words came slower at first, then easier, like the warm air in that house loosened them from where I'd been storing them. Her hand, resting on the table, shifted slightly closer. Not enough to call it a gesture, just enough for her fingers to catch the edge of mine when I stopped speaking. It wasn't a hold, not yet, just a quiet acknowledgement, skin to skin for the briefest moment. "That sounds heavy," she said, her eyes steady on me. "You don't have to carry all of it alone." The clock ticked louder after that. It wasn't the hour that startled me. It was the quiet in between the ticks, the kind that asked you to notice how close someone was sitting. She tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear again, her sleeve falling slightly, and the light caught the pale curve of her wrist. I looked away, not out of disinterest, but because looking too long felt like stepping past a line we hadn't named yet. We sat there, 2 mugs cooling, 2 lives briefly overlapping more than they were supposed to. And in that silence I realized, this wasn't small talk anymore. This was the start of something neither of us had planned for. At some point, the tea was gone. The mugs sat forgotten on the table, the faint ring of warmth they'd left behind now cooled to nothing. The rain outside had slowed to a drizzle, tapping softly against the glass like fingertips on a drum. Inside, the house was still except for the low hum of a lamp and the faint rhythm of her breathing. She rose first, almost reluctantly, gathering the empty mugs. The cardigan slipped slightly as she leaned toward the sink, revealing the curve of her shoulder beneath the pale silk of her top. She didn't notice, or maybe she did and just didn't fix it right away. "I'll make more," she said lightly, her voice calm but with a thread of something underneath it. "You don't have to," I replied, though I didn't move to leave. She glanced back at me then, over her shoulder, and something about that look felt different. Not neighborly. Not polite. Something slower, deeper, like a question she hadn't decided to ask yet. I stood, unsure why, and moved toward the counter. The kitchen was small enough that when I stopped behind her, the space between us felt charged, like the air before a storm. She turned slightly, enough that we were close enough for me to notice the way her hair brushed the side of her neck, close enough to catch the faint scent of lavender, and something warmer I couldn't name. She handed me a fresh cup. Our fingers touched, just for a second, but in that second, something shifted. It wasn't the first time we touched tonight, but this was different. This lingered. Skin against skin, warm and deliberate, like a word spoken twice to make sure it's heard. Her eyes met mine over the rim of the cup. Neither of us smiled this time. We just looked. Long enough for the hum of the refrigerator to sound like a drumbeat. Long enough for me to feel the question hanging between us: what now? I should have stepped back. She should have turned away. But neither of us moved. Instead, she brushed past me to set something on the counter. Her arm grazed mine as she passed, and I swear I felt that touch all the way up my spine. It was soft, fleeting, but it stayed. When she spoke again, her voice was quieter, almost like it belonged to the space between us, not the room. "It's later than I thought," she murmured, but she didn't sound like she wanted the night to end. I set my cup down and leaned back slightly, watching her. For a long moment, we just stood there, the silence thick with everything we weren't saying. And in that still kitchen, with the rain whispering against the glass and her eyes steady on mine, I knew something had changed. We weren't just neighbors anymore. The clock on her wall ticked past 1, its steady rhythm the only sound filling the small living room now. The rain had stopped, leaving a quiet sheen on the windows. I sat there, fingers curled around the warm mug, staring into the faint swirls left at the bottom. "I should probably get going," I said finally, my voice low but uncertain. It wasn't conviction. It was the kind of line you say because it feels like the right one, even when a part of you hopes someone will ask you not to. She looked at me for a moment, her lips parting as if to speak, then closing again. The cardigan slipped further down her arm as she shifted on the couch, her hand resting loosely on the blanket between us. "This house gets quiet at night," she murmured, almost to herself. "Sometimes too quiet." Something in the way she said it felt heavier than the words themselves. I glanced at her, and for the first time that night, I saw past the polite composure. There was a weariness there, and under it, something softer. Something waiting. "I didn't mean to keep you," I said. "You didn't," she replied quickly, her eyes meeting mine now. "It's been nice having someone to talk to." Her fingers brushed mine as she reached for her tea, light and brief, but this time neither of us moved away. That single point of contact felt more honest than anything we'd said so far. "I think," she began, then paused, her voice catching faintly before she steadied it. "I think people underestimate how heavy it can feel, being surrounded by things, by routines, and still feeling unseen." The words sat between us, delicate and sharp at once. I swallowed, unsure whether to answer or just hold the space she had opened. "That sounds familiar," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. She gave a small, almost rueful smile. "I thought it might." The blanket slipped from the couch edge as she pulled it slightly toward her, and without asking, she draped the other side over my lap. It wasn't a bold move, not in appearance, just a practical gesture for a chilly night, but the way it lingered, the way her fingers brushed my knee in the process, made it feel like something else entirely. For the first time, I noticed the faint scent of her shampoo when she leaned a little closer, the quiet hush of her breath when she sighed. "I don't know what you were planning to do tonight," she said softly, "but I'm glad you didn't." I looked at her then, really looked, at the lines near her eyes that deepened when she smiled, at the way her thumb traced the rim of her mug like a habit she'd never noticed. And even though neither of us said what was hanging there, the silence didn't feel empty anymore. It felt full, like the night was waiting for us to decide what came next. The living room had grown still, as if the house itself was holding its breath. The jazz had long faded to silence, leaving only the hum of the heater and the soft rustle of her cardigan as she adjusted it around her shoulders. Outside, the rain had stopped entirely, and a thin band of moonlight fell across the floor. "It's late," I said finally, my voice more a thought spoken aloud than a decision. Her eyes didn't leave mine. They were steady, calm, but there was a tension there, something that wavered between reason and longing. "He won't be home till morning," she whispered. The words lingered in the space between us, heavier than the air itself. I felt the warmth of the blanket over both our laps, the faint heat from the tea that neither of us had touched in minutes, the small distance her shoulder had left before finding its place next to mine. I turned my head slightly, and for a heartbeat, we were so close I could feel the breath she held. "You know I should go," I murmured. "I know," she replied, her voice barely audible, the kind of tone that carries more truth than it dares to. My fingers twitched slightly against my leg. Hers, resting near mine, shifted just enough for the backs of our hands to meet. It wasn't a hold, not yet, it was the quiet confirmation of everything we'd been circling around all night. She looked down then, a faint smile at the corner of her lips, not playful, not triumphant. Just relieved. "I didn't think I'd want company tonight," she said, her words steady but her breath not. "And yet," I said softly, "here we are." There was no rush. No sudden movement. Just the slow awareness that neither of us had moved apart. Her fingers finally turned, lightly brushing against mine, a question without words. I answered it by not pulling away. For a long time, we stayed like that, no words, just the sound of her breath evening out, the quiet warmth of the room settling around us. Her hand lifted slightly, hesitated in the space between us, then rested gently against my cheek. Her palm was warm, her thumb brushing just beneath my eye as if memorizing the shape of that moment. Neither of us leaned in. Neither of us crossed the line that still stood there, fragile and visible. But the line felt different now. Not a wall, just a threshold waiting to be named. The clock struck 2. The sound felt softer this time, almost approving. She pulled her hand back slowly, and the room seemed to exhale with her. "Stay a little longer," she whispered. And I did. Because sometimes the answer you give isn't in the words you choose, it's in the silence you refuse to leave. The night surrendered slowly. It wasn't a sudden change, but a quiet fading, the way the dark turns to gray before the world remembers how to be awake again. The heater hummed gently, and the faint scent of lavender still lingered in the air, now mixed with the cooler edge of dawn seeping through the curtains. She sat beside me, her shoulder brushing mine beneath the shared blanket. At some point in the hours that followed, the tea had gone cold, the words had softened, and the silence had become its own kind of conversation. I hadn't planned to stay this long. Neither of us had planned for any of it. Yet here we were, two people who were supposed to be strangers of circumstance, now watching the world slowly turn pale outside her window. Her head rested lightly against my shoulder, her breath steady, her fingers loosely folded in her lap. I looked at her profile in that early light, the faint lines beneath her eyes, the softness in her expression, the quiet peace that hadn't been there at the start of the night. She stirred when the first bird called somewhere down the street, pulling the blanket a little tighter around her. "Morning already?" she whispered, her voice still carrying the weight of night. "Almost," I said. Neither of us moved right away. The moment felt fragile, like a bridge that would hold as long as no one rushed across it. When I finally stood, she rose with me. The room felt different now, not heavier, not lighter, just honest. The kind of honest that lingers when all the distractions have fallen quiet. "I should go," I said, and this time, the words felt real. She nodded, though her hand lingered on the edge of the blanket I set down. "Thank you," she said simply, no explanation needed. At the door, the cold air met me again, sharp and clear after the warmth inside. She followed, cardigan drawn close, standing in the pale gold of a streetlight that hadn't yet flickered off. Either of us said what this night meant. We didn't give it names or promises. But when her fingers brushed mine as I stepped out, the lightest touch, a goodbye and a beginning at once, I felt it settle somewhere deeper than words. She smiled then, small and soft, A look that carried both gratitude and a trace of something unspoken. "Get some rest," she murmured. I walked back to my place with the cool dawn against my face, the scent of her home still clinging to my sleeves, and a quiet thought forming like the first trace of sun on the horizon. Sometimes, the heart doesn't ask for permission. It just finds its reflection in the quiet, and waits for you to notice. The door closed gently behind me. The street returned to silence. But nothing felt the same anymore.